Well, hi everyone. Welcome. I'm Angie Mock, the CEO of Boys and Girls Clubs of San Antonio, and thank you for joining us for our first ever Teen Talk with Lorenzo Gomez, who you're going to meet in just a minute. So on June 1st, we reopened our doors with enhanced safety protocols for our club kids and our staff. And after really just unbelievable times that we've all experienced, we were so happy to see all our club members again, because our vision for club members has not changed at all, because our vision is to help our club members reach their full potential. But unfortunately, the gaps to achieving the goal have seismically shifted because of everything we've been going through with COVID-19. So to support our efforts, we, Boys and Girls Club of San Antonio, have launched a new series of Teen Talks as part of our Together We Will campaign. And Together We Will is our commitment to do whatever it takes for young people in San Antonio, and for young people like all of you who are here at the Mays Family Clubhouse today, socially distanced, to do whatever it takes for you to flourish and for you to thrive. So I can't think of anyone better and more exciting to kick off our inaugural Teen Talk than Lorenzo Gomez. Lorenzo is a central figure in San Antonio's rapidly evolving tech ecosystem, and he's had so many important roles in our city. He's led the development of Tech Block, the 80/20 Foundation, and Geekdom, and he's currently CEO of Geekdom, of Geekdom Media, and he's an author of 2 books. Both are memoirs, and I love memoirs. I love reading memoirs. The first one, The Cilantro Diaries, Business Lessons from the Most Unlikely Places. It details the foundational principles he used to navigate his career from an H-E-B grocery produce clerk to a CEO with minimal college education. And I'm excited what you're going to hear about today. It's his second book called Tafolla Toro, 3 Years of Fear. And I think you guys are really going to relate to this, because he reframes in this book scenes from his middle school life and his mental health journey in middle school through the lens of his healthier adult self now. Now, when he's not traveling the country, Lorenzo loves to share the secrets of his, when traveling the country, he loves to share with people the secrets of his success, regardless of circumstances. But when he's not doing that, he lives in San Antonio, Texas, I believe, really not too far from here, in the downtown area, with 4 cats. And the cats supposedly share his love of Wes Anderson films, good choice, and oatmeal raisin cookies. And I believe there's one thing I also want to add that's relatively new in the life of Mr. Lorenzo Gomez. I believe that you just got married and you're a newlywed, so congratulations! And welcome.
All right, can you hear me? Volume good? Wes Anderson fan over here? Yes. Love it. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here for the first ever Teen Talk, although I'm very far away in age from being a teenager. And if you got closer, which would violate social distancing, you would see all of my gray hairs in my beard. But I'm so excited to be here and talk to you a little bit about my second book, Tafolla Toro. And I released it last year in October. And whenever you release a book, you always think, well, my mom's just gonna buy 5 copies and then I can move on with my life. And it's done really, really well since it was published. It got #1 in 10 categories on Amazon in the first day that it came out, and it's done really well. There was a local school network that bought 1,000 copies for their students, and all of this was a big surprise for me. And I think that it's not that I'm some special author. I think it's because the topic of mental health is just very important, and especially right now when we're all sort of in lockdown or sort of constrained, mental health is really important. And so the subtitle of my book is 3 Years of Fear. Show of hands, anybody that's ever dealt with fear, right, in their life. And this has become something that I realized as an adult was really the theme of my middle school, my high school, and then into my early 20s. And when I was going to Tafolla, everybody know where Tafolla is? So Tafolla is on the west side. And when I went there, it was this really amazing program that the San Antonio Independent School District had set up. And it was the first magnet program ever. It was called the multilingual program, where you could learn a foreign language. And they had Russian and Latin and French and Spanish. And I wanted to learn Spanish because I didn't know Spanish. And I was like, Mom, I want to feel like a real Mexican and know Spanish. And she said, no, you're going to learn Latin. And I was like, well, nobody speaks Latin. And my grandma was like, yeah, nobody speaks Latin except the Pope. Is he going to talk to the Pope one day? But she said, no, you're going to learn Latin. It's going to help you in college. So I took Latin, and I learned a lot, and I really loved it. But what I didn't know at the time when I was in Tafolla, and this was in the 90s, so I'm going to tell you really how old I am. But I didn't know this, but in the 90s, San Antonio went through its highest levels of gang violence in the history of the city. And then the year I went into 7th grade was the highest spike in drive-by shootings. And my street where I lived was the second highest for drive-by shootings in the whole city. And so if you can imagine 12-year-old Lorenzo, I probably weighed 80 pounds back then. My ears were a little bit bigger. I was very insecure. And so you imagine me looking around, and I was just afraid all the time. And so I wrote this book because many years later, I decided to tackle my mental health. And so when I decided to do that, I finally got tools to deal with a lot of this fear and anxiety that I dealt with. And so that's what the book's about. But what I do in the book is I tell a lot of stories, and it's stories from my first day all the way to when I graduate high school. But one of the things that I do is after every story, I write a letter from adult me to 12-year-old me. And if you read the book, you won't know it, but the letters each contain clinical mental health principles that I learned in therapy. And so they're sort of my gift to you. And if you're struggling with any of the things that I struggle with, the letters is where you'll get some real tools that you can use on a day-to-day basis. So that's sort of the summary of the book. And I'm so excited, and thank you so much for getting some copies of it. I hope you'll give it a read. But I guess now it's time where you fire the Scud missiles at me and give me all the hard questions. Is that right?
Sure.
All right, let's do it.
Hello.
Speak up.
Hello, my name's Aiden, and I'm here to ask you a couple questions. So the first question I have is, how have your experiences helped you be successful?
Aiden, that's a great question. How have my experiences helped me to be successful? Well, I think that, when I was growing up and I was dealing with fear, I think the main way that it helped me was when I got to working in my career, when I got my job at H-E-B and my job at Rackspace, I would run across these crazy situations, and I would always think to myself, well, this isn't as bad as a drive-by. And so, as long as I'm afraid, that no one's going to shoot me in this meeting, I think I'm going to be all right. And so it sort of took away a lot of fear that I had, and it made me way more It made me more of a risk taker, because I was so bold in these workplaces because I wasn't afraid that someone was going to actually beat me up. And I said, you know what, I can work through this problem and I can solve this problem. And so that was probably one of the ways that I was able to channel that experience from my past. And I took a lot of risks. I think they're all sort of calculated risks. I moved to the UK, so I moved to another country when I was working at Rackspace, which is very risky, and it totally paid off. And those were things that I don't think I had done if I hadn't have had that experience growing up. Yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you for answering.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Aiden, can you introduce yourself?
Oh yes, I am Aiden Matthews. I am 2020 Youth of the Year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I feel like we're on the same page here.
Awesome. Absolutely.
Now going for real. My next question is,
We're getting feedback that no one can hear on the live stream on Facebook, so if everyone can bring their volume up about 3 notches, that would be awesome.
Yes. Sorry about that. My next question is, what kept you from telling your family about your fears, and how did you face your fears?
So the question is, what kept me from telling my family about my fears, and what was the second part?
How did you face your fears?
And how did I face my fears? Well, I think what kept me from telling my family about my fears was I was very afraid that they were going to be disappointed in me. And this was so interesting because my family is so supportive. My parents, my brothers, my sisters, they're all very encouraging. For some reason, and this is probably the first lesson that I want to teach you from a mental health perspective, is that all of us are telling ourselves several stories every day, all day. And so to answer your question, one of the stories I told myself was, nobody cares and nobody can help me. And that story was a complete lie. But I told myself that this story was true, and I said, look, they're not gonna help me. What are they gonna do? Come to my school and beat up the bullies? You know, they're not gonna be able to stop gangs from shooting each other. And so I told myself, hey, the adults can't help me. They probably don't even care about what I'm going through. I just have to suck it up and deal with it. And what I learned later in therapy is that that was an untrue story. And how I dealt with it much later was I had to tell myself a new story, which is actually, you gotta give the adults a chance, right? You have to be courageous enough to be vulnerable to someone and say, hey, I'm really struggling with this thing and I really, really need some help. But it's very hard because when you're vulnerable, you can get hurt, right? So you can get hurt twice as bad, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And I think the answer to your second question, which is how did I face my fears? I will tell you I didn't. And I hid from them, and I tried not to talk about them, and because I didn't face them, it ended up creating a lot of really bad habits in my life that I took all the way up until I was adult. And so I'm glad you asked that question because I would tell you to not do it the way I did it, right? I buried it, I didn't talk about it, and I moved on, and it created a lot of unhealthy behavior. Yeah, that was a great question.
Thank you. And I guess my last question is, why do you think that young men have a harder time processing their emotions?
Oh, wow. So the question is, why do you think that young men have a harder time processing their emotions? And I don't know if it's a culture thing. You know, there was a show a long time ago about a mafia boss, this Italian mafia boss, and the whole show was he was going to get therapy in secret. And he didn't want anybody to know that he was going to a therapist because they were gonna all think he was big, that he was weak. And I think that a lot of men struggle with this. It's this, and so going back to what is the story you're telling yourself? I think a lot of young men are told, hey, you need to suck it up, right? That if you're tough and that you're a man, you can just deal with this. That that just don't worry about this, don't linger, don't cry. And that story is absolutely not true. And I think that it sort of comes from a place where you want to feel masculine and you want to feel tough. But I think that definition is incorrect. And so I'm here to tell you that if that's the story that you've been told, and if that's the story you're telling yourself, that's actually an incorrect story. Because there is nothing harder and tougher and braver than expressing your feelings. But we're afraid of our feelings because they can be very wild, right? They can run hot, you lose your temper. And so I think a lot of young men they look up, and a lot of people, and I know a lot of people in my life that have also struggled with this. But one of the things that I've found is that when someone goes first, people want to open up. And so so my therapist was one of the first adult men. His name's Marnie. He's a good friend of mine. And he said, you go to the gym and you've never worked out, you're gonna fling the weights around, right? You're gonna throw out a muscle, you're gonna hurt yourself, and it's because you don't have any training and you don't have any tools. He goes, and dealing with your emotions is just like going to the gym. If you don't have any training and any tools, you're gonna throw your temper around and you're gonna damage all of the relationships. And so he said, we need to practice, we need to have some skills to deal with your emotions. And so I think that so many times, and also the movies don't help, the music, doesn't help, because we're told, hey, just bury it, don't talk about it, suck it up. And I think that is not the right story. The correct story is there is a way to deal with it. And so I hope that through the stories in my book that I'll show you that, hey, somebody's got to go first. And if you go first, then you can see that it's not impossible, that it's not weakness, and that hopefully you can take a stab at it too. Yeah, great question.
Thank you for answering.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi, my name is Venus Abuelos, and I'm the team coordinator for the Mace Clubhouse. And my question for you is, what is the lasting effect that the FOIA and the neighborhood you grew up in has had on you?
So the question is, what is the effect that Tafolla and the neighborhood around it had on me, sort of in my life? And you know, I've reflected upon that for many years, and I always knew when I was little that I wanted to write this book, because when I was seeing some of the things that I saw, I remember thinking, even as a 12-year-old, I remember thinking, man, this is like watching a movie. I can't believe I just saw, you know, those 12 guys beat up that one guy, or that guy like shoot that gun, or it was just so crazy to me. I thought, man, I'm watching a movie right now. And so I think that the effect that it had on me, there's a couple. I think the first one is that even though I lived on a street with people similar to me, that even the house next to me was almost like a different solar system. You know, my family is a big Hispanic family. There's 7 kids in my family, and my parents, you know, raised us in one house, and so, you know, I shared everything until I was, you know, 20, you know, and so one of the lasting effects that it had on me was, you see how different people's lives are, how different their family is. I had 2 parents, 3 brothers and 3 sisters. And I had a lot of friends that had 1 parent, no parent. Both of my parents worked because they had to work. They even worked on the side. My mom used to sell tamales during Christmas, you know, and to get a little bit of extra money. But I had so many people that even lived across the street who their experience was completely different from mine. And I think that that's one of the things that taught me is everybody's story is different. And I think that one of the things that we do incorrectly is we apply our story to everybody. And I think that you have to understand that everybody has their own story, and you have to take the time to learn other people's story. And that was probably the biggest thing that the FOIA had on me. I think much later, when I got out and I started working at Rackspace and I started traveling the world, I realized that if you grew up in a neighborhood like Tafolla, it's not that we were not as smart as the people that grew up in wealthy areas. It's about opportunity. And that anybody that comes from that neighborhood is capable of doing the highest level things there are if you can find the opportunity. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so thankful for places like the Boys and Girls Club, because they're going to give you an opportunity to really shine, which is what Tafolla gave me as a young man. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I also am curious if you ever told your parents about the things that you were experiencing when you were at the FOIA.
No, so the question is, did I ever tell my parents about the things that I was experiencing at Tafolla? And the short answer is no. And I'm sure my parents were going like, hey, come on, like they would have totally helped me. And I think the reason I didn't tell them was I didn't know my environment was unsafe. I didn't know in 1993 when I was in 7th grade that it was the city's highest year of gang violence. I didn't know that. I didn't know that until 10 years from there. And so I didn't know how to put words to my fear with my parents. And I just thought, I'm the 6th of 7 kids. Everyone else went through middle school, and everyone else seems to be fine. What is wrong with me? So I told myself this story. There's got to be something wrong with me. Why am I so afraid? And all of my siblings are not afraid. And I think that was an incorrect story. What I should have done is I should have asked my parents, hey, everybody else seems to be okay, but I'm really struggling with fear. And they probably would have sat me down and said, hey, let's talk about it. And I finally would have unloaded. But I didn't tell them out of fear. I was embarrassed. And specifically, I told myself a story that there must be something wrong with me if I'm the only one of my siblings that's afraid. And that is just not a true story, because everybody deals with it. And as soon as you say, hey, that's afraid, 10 other people raise their hand, right? And so I think that I wish someone would have told me that was a lie. And so one of the tools I want to tell you is that nobody can tell you a story about yourself that you don't accept, right? So if someone says you're stupid, you have to accept those words and tell it to yourself. Or you can say, actually, I don't accept that, and that is not a true story. The true story is, I might be bad at math, right, which was that was always my weakness. I might be bad at math. That is not the same as I'm stupid. I can work on math. I can go to tutoring. I can read more about it. I can get support and get better at math. That's a different story. And so I think that what you tell yourself as a story has so much power, and a lot of times you can take power away from people by saying, I'm not going to accept that story.
Awesome. I have one last question for you. While reading about the Summer of Drive-Bys, you described the heavy gang activity in your neighborhood. You share a near-death experience and the constant threat of violence. There is a sense of uncertainty and constant fear in your life. What did your parents do to help you understand what was going on around you?
So the story that you're referring to was, I believe it was either my 7th grade summer or my 8th grade summer, and this was the summer where the drive-bys in the city were at the highest level, and I was really addicted to Sunkist that year. Like I couldn't drink enough Sunkist, and so I was walking to the picnic foods to get a Sunkist, and this car pulled up next to me, my neighbors across the street, they had done a lot of drive-bys, and so this van came to retaliate, and so I'm walking in front of their house, and this van, it was a brown van, pulled up, and they just stuck this gun out the window. So it pulls up right here. The house is right there. They stick out this gun, and they just start shooting, and all of my Navy SEAL training came out, and I just froze. I just went like this. And then by the time that I sort of opened up, I could see my neighbor coming out, and he had a gun, he was shooting, and I was like, maybe I should get out of here. So I ran back home. And so the answer to your question is, what happened with my parents? My parents were so concerned. And so my parents actually looked for another house to buy, to move neighborhoods. And they ended up saying, hey, you know what? We can't afford anything else. And all the other neighborhoods, they look just as bad or worse than this neighborhood we're in. And so they stuck it out. And I think that if I look back on all those years, what they decided to do next was just amazing. What they decided to do was they said, you know what? We're going to be the best neighbors that we can be, and we're going to take charge of this neighborhood. My parents became like the Boys and Girls Club of West Hermosa Street by themselves, right? And they would take in kids, and they would babysit, and they would cook for everyone around them. And specifically, my mother, she's so awesome. And my mom was not having any of this gang violence. If she saw a gang member with a gun, she was on the phone with the cops. And there's a story that I tell in the book where there was one day where there was these 7 guys walking down our street, and they all had their guns. I was like, am I watching Tombstone or some crazy Wild West movie? And they're walking down our street, and my mom is on the phone with the blinds out, on the phone. Officer, there's 4 guys right here, and one's in a blue shirt. And I start screaming at my mom, like, Mom, please, what are you doing? They're gonna see you, and they're gonna shoot us. And my mom's like, no, they're not. And we're like, please, Mom. And my mom turns, she's like, they're not gonna shoot us. The Lord's gonna protect us. And so sure enough, these guys walk by, the cops come, they break it up, and I was like, oh, it must have worked. That prayer must have worked. But my mom decided that she was gonna be the change in our neighborhood. And she started with our house. And I think that so many times in our life, you sort of wanna run away. But I think what that neighborhood needed was my parents to adopt the neighborhood. And so many times we want to move away from that apartment complex, or want to move away or quit that job. And a lot of times we need to turn around and be the positive change in those places. And that's really what my parents did. And what happened is they showed me by example, so that when I got to the highest level of my career, I did the same thing. I said, you know what, I'm gonna move back into that neighborhood because I want to copy what they showed me as adults. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
I'm Amanda Garcia. I'm the branch director here at Mace Family Clubhouse. My first question is, can you tell us about your career and what you do now?
The question is, can I tell you about my career and what I do now? It's a very complicated question. Sometimes I really don't know myself. So I think I'll tell you sort of the summary is I grew up in San Antonio. My first job was at a grocery store that none of you probably know about called Handy Andy. And anybody here ever had, what? This is shocking. Shocking information. So I worked at a Handy Andy, but when you work in the grocery world, there's only one place you want to work. There's only one Nordstrom. The highest level of the grocery world is H-E-B. And I wanted to work at H-E-B bags. Everyone in my family worked at H-E-B. And so I finally got a job at H-E-B, and I loved it. And then one of my best friends from high school, a guy named Dax Moreno, started working at a computer place, and he took me with him to a place called Gateway Computers. Anybody ever heard of Gateway 3? They used to have these cow spotted boxes. Okay, I really don't. All right. So I worked at Gateway, and then there was a guy I knew there named James Brem, and he said, hey, I'm working at this crazy, tiny company that you've never heard of. It's downtown, it's super small, it'll probably go out of business, but they buy us food every week. They just pass around menus. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, it's called Rackspace, but it probably will go out of business, but you should come work here anyway. And I said, okay. And so I went to go work at Rackspace. I was 20 years old. I had no college degree. I didn't know anything about technology. And I got this job because my friend recommended me. And that really changed my life. And that's not exaggerating. Rackspace changed my life. And it gave me a career, gave me skills, gave me a network, gave me all these things. And so when I left Rackspace, I went to a small startup that completely bombed and failed. And then the owner of Rackspace, who's a really amazing man named Graham Weston, said, hey, I want you to come work for me because we're going to start a tech scene downtown and try to redo what Rackspace did only times 1,000. And I remembered, when he told me that, I remembered Rackspace hiring 20-year-old Lorenzo with no college degree. And I said, if we can do that times 1,000, man, sign me up. And so we moved into downtown. We started a co-working space called Geekdom. We started a foundation called the 80/20 Foundation, Tech Block. And the whole purpose is to try to recreate a tech ecosystem so that more Rackspaces can be born, to give every one of you an opportunity just like I had when I was 20 years old. And so it's a really inspiring mission to me because I lived it. I thought, man, they had no reason to hire me as a young guy. And they did, and I got to travel the world because of it. And so I have a new company now called Geekdom Media, and we do content, releasing things like these books. But the sole focus of what I do is trying to nurture the tech scene downtown so that there are more companies hiring more people, giving more chances and opportunities for you and your parents and your cousins and everybody. And it's so cool because there's been so much progress that we see, but we need a lot more. But that's really what I do every day is I wake up and I'm trying to get more jobs created so that people that grew up with a similar background like me can have an opportunity.
That's awesome. How would you deal with your fear and anxiety that you faced growing up?
How would I deal with it?
Yes.
How would I deal with it now, or how would I deal with it back then?
Back then.
So the way that I would deal with it now, back then, is with the tools that I've gathered now as an adult. And I think that, one of the things that I would start with is it is okay to talk about your feelings. And I think that this is something that nobody ever tells you, and you think, oh my gosh, this is, hippie stuff, right? And I'm here to tell you that you have to. If you want to be a healthy human being, you're gonna have to learn how to talk about your feelings. That's just the way it is. Because if you don't, then they come out in some type of explosive way. So that's the first thing. And I think that just like having good nutrition, just like having good physical fitness, you need to have some tools and some skills, maybe even a trainer or a coach, to help you deal with fear and anxiety. And so for me, I found it when I was mid-30s in therapy. I went to 2 therapists, and I'm here to tell you, I'm gonna give you permission. If you don't like your doctor or your plumber or your therapist, you fire them right away and get a new one, right? So I'm giving you permission right now. Fire them and get a new one. I had 2 therapists that weren't very helpful. And then I found this one therapist that just changed everything. And like a great coach, he said, I'm gonna give you tools and exercises so that when you're not here, you can do them on your own. And that changed everything in my mental state. And so I would go back in, if I could, and give my 12-year-old self those tools. The good news is that a lot of those tools are in the book, in the letters. And so in those letters, I tried to pack at least 2 or 3 principles that if you read them, they are giving you real things that you can describe. And one of them is writing a letter to yourself. Because writing a letter to yourself allows you to verbally express what you're feeling, to be very vulnerable, and if you want to show someone, you can, and if you don't, you can throw it away. And I think that what it does is it gives you the power, puts the power back in your hands, so that you are in control of the story. But that's what I would do.
And then my last question, what would you say to someone who is struggling alone today?
So the question is, what would I say to someone that's struggling and feels like they're alone today? And I would say that you're not alone, but more importantly, the story that you're telling yourself is that there is no one that can help me. There is no one that I can be in community with. And I would submit to you that that's not true. That you should tell yourself a new story, which is you're not alone, and there are so many people that want to know you, that value you, and to be in community. And there are places like this, like the Boys and Girls Club, that are here to provide amazing community, to show you that you're not alone. But it starts with the story you tell yourself. And if someone out there has told you, hey, no one wants to be around you, right, that you're not worth being friends with, that story is not true. And you need to tell yourself a new story, which is, I am worth it, and I am valuable, and I want to be in community with people and not be alone. That's the message I would give. All right.
I think we have some questions in the audience.
Questions from the audience? All right. Launch the grenades.
Who's next?
My question is, in what ways have these experiences helped and hurt you as an adult?
Sorry, will you repeat the question?
In what ways have these experiences that you've gone through helped and